Welcome, I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, Thus Says the Lord, God Speaks Through His Servants and Prophets. Today we'll be talking about lesson 18 of our study, which covers selections from the beginning of the book of the prophet Daniel. In this lesson and the next, we will be concluding our journey through the prophets of the Old Testament with the book of the prophet Daniel. You may have, as you were reading this, thought, why is this here? Why is this the end of our time in the Old Testament, rather than way back toward the beginning of our study when the people were in exile in Babylon? Because ostensibly, that is when and where this book takes place, right? It talks about the prophet Daniel and three of his compatriots and their time and experience in Babylon during the exile. That's what it talks about, but it's not what it means, and it's not who it was for. And that's why we will find this book here in our study. If you remember where we left off, with our review of the Maccabees, we began talking about the confrontation of Greek culture with Jewish culture, and how that overlap was working, and some of the challenges and problems. We definitely saw instances where the Greek side won, and too many Jewish people were too eager to adopt Greek customs, traditions, culture, even when those things were at odds with or contrary to the worship of God. And so we see here in the book of Daniel, this is designed as a story meant to highlight how to correctly and in a good way coexist with a foreign power while staying true to the correct worship of God. It is, in a sense, almost a parable of how to do that. What it is not is an historical account of what was going on in exile. There will be things like a giant golden statue that are very unlikely to have occurred, but make a solid point. So do not take this as history. Take this as someone at the time of the Greeks and the Seleucids looking back and creating this story about something that could have happened. Again, prophetic story showing us truth about how we relate to God, but not necessarily, and definitely not historically true in every case. So don't read it as a history. That we're reading it as a prophet. It's a book of prophets. That's why it's in the section of the Old Testament that is the prophets, and not in the historical section at the time of the exile, before Ezra and after 2 Kings. If people thought this was history, they'd have put it there, but it's not. It's a prophet. And so the intro of the study astutely points out this is a different kind of prophecy, in that it's not deriving prophecy from telling us about things that are yet to come, although it does that too. That'll be next time. This time, we're deriving prophecy from stories about things that have already happened. So it's a look at the past, but again, it's kind of a manufactured look at the past. That is this vision of how God fits into that time in exile. The key point, because this isn't all fake, right? It's not fake at all. It's just not historical. Is there's still the fascinating thing that happened, that these people were allowed to leave captivity and exile and return to their own land, and seemed to have very solid support from the powers that be in so doing. That is still remarkable and has to speak to how they conducted themselves in exile. So basically, Daniel and his three friends are serving to represent the behavior of the Jewish people as a whole in captivity. And we talked about, when we were talking through the more historical parts, we talked about their clear devotion, a powerful and profound devotion to observance of the law emerged in this period of exile. So we see some of that here in Daniel and his friends. But the point isn't what happened in exile. The point is what should be happening now in Jerusalem and Judah in relationship to the Greeks. And that's a big deal and a very important thing. It would also be fair to suggest, we've talked about kind of this return from exile as a second pass, a retelling of the flight from Egypt into the Promised Land. We see here another repetition of a trope from that time period. I think very deliberately so, and that you will see marked similarities between Daniel and Joseph that will highlight as well, who is kind of the archetype in the Old Testament of how to thrive under foreign rule and persecution, and to succeed in that environment while not losing one's identity in the faith. So we're going to kind of see this pathway being drawn from Joseph to Daniel, and to a lesser extent friends, to you, Jew, living in the time of Greek invasion, should be doing the same thing. And so that's where we're going, why and how some of this is. In this first section, we're going to talk through some of the juicier stories of some of the things that happen. And then in the next lesson, we will turn our focus toward some of those more future-looking apocalyptic writings that make the book of Daniel seem somewhat inaccessible from time to time. But this is the relatively easy part, and we will get through it, and we will hopefully learn a lot about how to hold true to our faith under foreign rule. So we introduce a few characters and the scenario here in this first little bit. To tee it up in the point in history, it's right after exile. We're at the palace. The open-minded conquering king wants to learn about the conquered cultures, and so has a habit of bringing in some young, hopefully ambitious and somewhat impressionable people familiar in the conquered culture to integrate into the conquering culture, but also then to allow an exchange of ideas, of information, of view on that culture. So you've got King Nebuchadnezzar, and then you've got Daniel and his companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, here showing up in the court, and they are given Babylonian names that all strongly imply worship of false gods, which tells us here is our conflict, right? On its surface, you have set up the conflict of they're in foreign territory, and there's this conflict between their identity, right? Their Hebrew name and identity of worshiping and serving their God, and then this Babylonian view that they're trying to impose on these guys of the Babylonian culture, religious tradition, worship. And that name represents everything about what the Babylonians are trying to do of imposing Babylonian everything upon these guys and integrating them in that way. And instead we see they're going to fundamentally reject that form of integration and work through a much harder and more dangerous pathway to still successfully integrate into this other society and keep true to their core identity that is theirs and their worship of God. And so the implication is then, how do we also fit in with Greeks the same way, right? We can't adopt Greek religious traditions. We can't adopt that Greek identity and let it overlay on top of us either. And then, of course, that bleeds over into our world today, right? The broad world outside definitely also has an identity that it would like us to adopt, us being Christians, and to allow to lay over on top of our Christian identity and to take that over. And we have to not allow that to happen either. And so there's that that call, that conflict that all of us are working through, and that here Daniel and friends are working through as well. Here we get into then the first of the explicit challenges between Daniel and companions and this other way of life, which is what they eat. There is the invitation. They're at court with the king. The invitation is you get to eat all the delicious, rich, good food that the king and his court eat. And not only get to, you need to. It's a privilege and an obligation. And they say, that's nice and all, but we pass. And then the eunuch overseeing their care says, I'm not sure you get to pass. It's my job to make sure that you are well taken care of, right? So here's the conflict. There's the eunuch who's legitimately trying to do his job well and means them no ill will, no harm at all. And in fact, the opposite. There's this idea of this rich food that probably definitely at times will contain things that they should not eat according to their law, which is, I'm sure, the heart of the concern. It's not that they don't want to be spoiled, it's that there are very clear dietary rules and things that they can't eat, such as pork. And so they would much rather eat a limited, safe diet and make sure that they don't end up eating things that they shouldn't be eating. And so the conversation with the eunuch is very reasonable. They say, okay, you're worried that, if we don't eat all this food, we're going to be unhealthy. And then it's probably very literally your head. So can we do a test, right? Just give us 10 days and let us just follow our law, do things our way. And then, if we look like we're doing okay, then please let us continue. And if we don't, they don't actually say, then we'll eat the food. They sort of imply, but there's no clear, if it doesn't work, we will go back and we'll do what you want. They just sort of imply it, and it doesn't come up because it is successful. Interesting possible idea here. It is a period of 10 days, and we are talking very much about something they're doing to test and guarantee the observance of the law. Numbers definitely can matter, and how many commandments are there? And so this is a period of keeping and of observance of the law, right? And after this tenfold period of observation of the law, they're healthier than everybody who's eating the king's rich food and drinking his wine. And so they get to continue to follow the law. So first challenge passed. They can eat what they want because they've demonstrated that it is fine for them. And everybody is more or less being very reasonable at this point. So, one down, more to come. Now we get into one that is a touchier issue than what people eat, which is, as the story tells us, king builds a giant gold statue and suggests that whenever they play whatever musical instruments, there's a whole array, that people should bow down and worship this golden image of the king. Again, if we look again back in time to the Exodus account, which so many of these things are a repetition of, there was a time where there was a golden image that the people worshipped wrongly as they were coming out of their time in Egypt. And that kind of set, as we've talked about, kind of set the precedent and the pathway for the people coming out initially of Egypt and the trajectory and the direction they went. There was always that tension where they were very tempted to be drawn away by these foreign things and bright and shiny objects. Here, as we're re-establishing, redoing the Exodus on better footing, instead we see this firm commitment from Daniel's three companions of the king threatens literal fiery death to anyone who doesn't worship this image, and they know the consequences, and they accept that might be the consequence, and they still will not worship this golden idol of the king, and are adamant that they're going to hold the line, persist with the boundaries of this is our faith, this is where they can give, they do, but this is the thing that we cannot do, right? We cannot worship the king. We cannot worship anything that's not God. And if that's not workable for us to thrive or even survive in Babylon, then we can't thrive or survive in Babylon. That's the choice. There isn't a choice, right? It's not, I will integrate however I have to, and then I'll figure it out later after I make it out of this situation. There are things that cannot and must not be compromised. And the big thing, the first commandment, right? The big one is one God, and you can worship that one God, and you can't worship any other gods because there aren't any other gods. And anybody who demands that level of worship, it just cannot be done. And now we're seeing they accept that. Also, there's this whole pantheon of Greek gods. Lots and lots and lots of them. So as we are looking at this account of what happened in Babylon, there's also, again, this idea of you can't worship any of these Greek gods either, right? Like they chose to be thrown into a fiery furnace rather than worship the king. You should likewise reject worship of any and all of these Greek gods as well. That's hard line. That has to be where you cannot compromise. So you cannot violate the law and the commandments as established during this dietary thing. And then you cannot, I mean, it's one of the commandments, it's the one of the commandments, but making sure it's abundantly clear, you absolutely must and have to worship God and only God. Here then we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego explain themselves, right? So the king says, hey, guys, I've heard that you aren't worshiping me, and I distinctly remember having threatened death for anyone who didn't worship me. Would you explain yourselves? And they basically say, nothing to explain. We're not going to do that. No disrespect intended, really, but we're definitely not doing that. And so I guess, king, do what you have to do. And so, good to his word and to his threat, the king gets ready to throw them into a furnace. But, of course, as is the case with many rulers, when they feel like their authority is being questioned or challenged, he's obviously not thrilled by that answer, right? He's hoping the threat of death will lead to compliance, and they'll say, oh, king, you're right. We should totally be worshiping you because we like our lives more than we like whatever crazy idea it is that we're not going to do that. And instead, they're just stone cold. Yep, we get it. We understand. Not anything we need to talk about. It's just we're not going to do what you asked. And we know that probably means you're going to kill us now. So he decided in his anger to heat the furnace 7 times. Again, we see numbers coming up in this book as significant. Number 7 in the scriptures, we've talked about it throughout all our studies, won't go into great detail here, but always implies like further and more coming. Like, right, it's not like a week is 7 days, but you get to an end of a week, you don't get to the end of time, right? You get to a new week. You're done with your 7, it means you're starting again, and there's more coming. 7s in the Old Testament always imply the beginning of something with more yet to come. And so here, that can be seen as probably a few different ways. One of them being it's 7 hot, meaning it's got to be hotter still than that, right? That's just the beginning of the heating. Or this pass of this trial in the furnace is only the first trial by fire that God's people will experience, and that there is then a repetition of this idea of being tried in or killed even in fire and emerging and remaining unharmed. Sorry, I got ahead of us. We don't know that happens yet. Of whatever's going to happen in this furnace. I think we all probably know the story, but I don't like to get ahead of myself. So either this is like this whole idea is a thing destined to repeat, and or heating the fire times 7 means we're really heating it like in a way that just a whole lot of heating. But either way, they go very calmly into the furnace that seems to be killing a whole lot of the king's people who try to get anywhere close to it to deal with that. Because again, this is the model, right? This is how we're supposed to hold to our faith in conflict with foreign things. You set the lines that you will not cross. You don't argue. You don't make a big dramatic scene about it. You just, this is what I will do. This is what I can't do. And I'll do what I will do. And I won't do what I can't do. And I'm going to hold the line no matter what. And that's what they exemplify here. And that is the message for us as well, is to make sure we understand where is your line, right? Where should it be and where is it? Because it's so easy to lie to ourselves and to say my line is definitely where it should be, and because that's where it should be, and there's no big deal there. It's probably pretty important that we think this through in a way that's very honest with ourselves about where really would my line be. Right? If my line's supposed to be here and it's here, okay, I should know that, right? Instead of just saying, well, I hope it would be at the right place at the right time, but right now maybe it's kind of not. Because if it's not, we probably should be thinking about why and trying to get our line to that point, right? And it's not just big things where right? We all think, oh, that moment of martyrdom is that, well, maybe not we all. From time to time, it's easy to think that would be a great opportunity to have in terms of working out my salvation, because I just have to be brave and hold to it for a little while, and I can get to all of that reward. But the line is much more likely that we're more likely to cross is not going to be the one where we're killed, at least in this country, in this culture. The line is much more likely going to be smaller things that we give on, right? More like the first example of I'll eat the diet of my captors because it's easier than putting up a fuss, right? Littler things. There are so many, and we've talked about them throughout the study, and I don't want to feel like I'm singling out any person or issue, so I'm not going to go deeply into what they are, but you all can think of things where we know what the truth of what God's asking us to do is, and we know what our culture thinks is right, and anything that even tries to see compromise or middle ground on those, right? You've moved your line. Anytime you don't say, this is the truth and this is unbendable, and you bend, you've moved your line, right? And that it can range from how we worship, how we live. It permeates every aspect of our lives, right? And gets back to this core idea of holiness. If you haven't put God as first thing in your life, then you're not serving God. And anything that you have put that you would bend your service of God for is ahead of God in your life. And then you're not doing as these guys did, then you are in some capacity bending knee and worshiping an idol, and trying to allow that to coexist with your service of God. And God doesn't allow that. That's a no-go for God, right? Again, first commandment. You cannot worship God if you put anything else equal to or ahead of God, period. And we too easily like to think that we can, right? Like, it's better than nothing, right? And maybe it is better than nothing. Don't stop doing everything because you're not getting this right, but you need to get this right. The prophets constantly, all of them are emphasizing this point, and basically everything in the Bible comes back to and emphasizes this point. The worship of God has to stand first and alone in your life. If there's anything that you put anywhere near that in terms of priority, then you have missed it. And that thing will bleed into your worship of God until it corrupts it. Even very good things, right? These aren't just bad things. Even things like family, right? How often, I know personally and know of so many people who have married non-Catholics because, he's so great, or she's so pretty and I like her a lot and we get along really well. And I'm not saying you can't do that, but you create this foundation where you say, being with this person is as important to me as my relationship with God. And then you've introduced conflict, and you're always being pulled away from the worship of God by a very good thing, right? Family, very good thing. In the cases I know, people generally love each other a lot and are very devoted to one another. It's not a bad thing, but it does bad things anyway, at least for the person really trying to serve God. Because it creates just that conflict, that division, and there's compromise, right? There would be things that you would otherwise do for God that now you're not doing for the sake of getting along. So you can do and mean well and do things that are good, and still, if they are occupying the same primacy of space in your life that is meant to be for God, then they still are bad. They will still lead you in the wrong direction. And that's not even talking about all the obviously bad things that we do that also crowd that out. But there are just so many things good in and of themselves that still create problem and conflict. And those are the ones, honestly, for anybody who would get this far in this Bible study, that are more likely to be the problem, right? You're probably not all gambling, drinking, yourself stupid, doing drugs, all the really reckless lifestyle things, although could be, but probably we're past some of that base level bad stuff, and we're into how do we manage the good stuff, and how do we sort and organize all the good things in our life in a way that it's all directed toward the worship and glory of God. And the way for that is anything in your life that you put ahead of God is not in the right place, period. And what these guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, demonstrate for us is, I know my number one, I know my priority, and I'm going to do everything I can in my life, eyes focused and ahead, with that one thing fixed as my North Star. And anything that tries to divert me from that, I'm just, nope, that's not okay. And I will accept whatever consequences are required to do that, because this is it. This is my thing. This is what is important to me. So, a few interesting things about what happens here in the furnace. Obviously, first of all, neat idea here. These guys are walking around in the furnace, worshiping God, and surrounded by all this fire, and they are not burned. And that's where this section focuses. There's this great little pull out. It's italicized. The numbering's a little different. Again, different versions of the Bible, etc. Different languages here in the book of Daniel going on. There's some Aramaic, there's some Hebrew. It's not all uniform, and that leads to a little bit of oddity here and there like this. But this is, again, beautiful passage. They're walking around. The walking around in the midst of the flames is such a strong image, right? And the idea that anybody else who comes close is getting burned up, and they're just kind of chilling, and God is making it not a problem at all. And that is, again, right, the interesting thing is that this is the incarnation of, or the realization of the situation they were already in, right? They were already surrounded by flame, threatening to burn and to kill them, in the form of Babylonians. And because they were holding true to God, they were already, this is just a different physical manifestation of the cultural reality they were already in. They were already, through their devotion to God, walking cleanly through the midst of the fire of Babylon without being burned. And so this is just a recasting of the situation that they were already in. And it shows, how are they doing it? They're singing hymns to God and blessing the Lord in the midst of the flames, which is how they were living their life in Babylon, and how they were able to hold true to their identity as servants of God in the midst of this foreign oppression. And here's the other important idea we see in the midst of this furnace is the people from outside look in and they see not 3 people, but 4. And it tees up, first of all, the 4th is like a son of the gods. It tees up what is very important in Daniel. There's a different idea of what it means to be human than we might, and it's the traditional Hebrew idea. We haven't dwelt much on it though, and it is very important in Daniel. And this is the first place we see it, and then we see it in a very important way in the next lesson as well. So since it's introduced here, we're going to talk about it. What is the difference between this idea of a son of the gods and a son of humanity, or a person? A human being in this Hebrew Jewish way of conceiving one is a weak and a mortal thing. We're defined and viewed as what we're not, right? God, angels, they're immortal, not sick, not subject to disease or injury. And the thing that makes us different from them in this conception is not a cognitive thing necessarily, although the angels are smarter than we are, but it's not so much cognition or perception. It's that weakness, that mortality, that thing that entered humanity at the very beginning, right? Like, that's one of the defining parts of humanity, is we sinned and then we became subject to death. And it changed what it meant to be human, and it changed our destiny. And what we're working to do is to restore that destiny. But that is the defining characteristic of humanity in this mindset, is mortal, which is very different from like Greek thought. Aristotle saw us as rational animals, right? The thing that's important about us is that we're smarter than all these animals. And so we're better than everything we're comparing ourselves against from a Greek and an Aristotelian point of view, right? And tend to be from the way we think about the world now, I would argue. The way the Jews thought about the world, we were worse than what we were being compared against, because we're being compared against God, because we're meant to be like God. We were originally meant to be with and like God, and the thing that defines us is that we're not now, and that's the problem. And so it's not we're so great and smart, which is this idea of humanity that formed outside of revelation from God, right? The idea is instead with divine revelation to tell us that we were meant to be like God. What makes us is that we're not. We were meant to be like God and we're not. And because of that, we are going to die. But not always, and not in every case, and not in every way. We can be in the midst of the fire that is meant to kill us and mortal, and yet not die. But it takes someone else to help us realize that, right? It takes a son of the gods to protect frail, mortal, fragile humans in the midst of this furnace. Otherwise, they are going to die. There's still this division between a son of the gods who is not subject to mortality and these humans, even the good ones, who are in the midst of death. They require to walk through alive the midst of this death, the presence of one who is not subject to mortality. That's going to be very important. There will be great payoff to that, but it's not in this lesson. So keep that in mind. It matters. For now, they need the protection of someone who is not human to survive in the midst of this furnace, which they do. And the king, seeing that, decides, I'm not going to mess around with this. If that can happen, I think that they're okay not worshiping me, because I can't do that. So they might be on to something with this God thing. I think we're going to roll with that, which makes sense. But so that's parable-wise, but the greater meaning is also suggested that if we hold firm to our faith in the midst of things that are around us, there will be those who accept it and who respect and acknowledge. Now you're going to have the other two, right? You're going to have the king before the furnace and the king after the furnace, right? The one who sees the challenge to his authority and power and does everything possible to get us. And the ones who grudgingly come to respect the devotion and who kind of come to accept it. The one king represents the two responses. And we won't always be so lucky in the world to have everyone go from the former to the latter. But both will definitely happen. Here's where the Joseph parallel really starts to come in, right? You've got the king, he's in his court. Again, probably not historical here. He has the idea, I would really like to drink wine from the vessels that were in the temple of the Lord that we took and definitely had around and knew where they were and cared enough about to drink out of them. That's the part that probably didn't happen in great likelihood, but you never know. But then what does happen is the king sees, and in this case everyone else, sees a sign that he cannot understand. A hand starts writing on the wall. And the king and none of the king's wise men have any idea what this could mean. And they badly want to interpret it because it's weird and they clearly think it's important. And so the king says, whoever can do this, I'll make like third in my kingdom. I'll give right? Joseph, Pharaoh has dreams. He can't understand them. Joseph explains them. He makes Joseph his number two, right? Here, Pharaoh and everybody, or king, and everybody else sees this vision. Nobody knows what it means. None of the wise men know what it means. And he says, whoever can figure it out, I'll make third in my kingdom, right? Clear parallel. Except now it's a written sign instead of a dream is the biggest difference, but the idea is still nobody knows what it means. here's where we see more of a difference between Joseph and Daniel. Joseph basically has good news for Pharaoh. Oh, Pharaoh, I'm sure you'd have figured this out because you're so wise and great, but your dream, is actually very helpful for all of your people in providing a way to save them from pending doom. So that's great. We can fix this. There's a solution, and we'll work together, and we'll save everyone. That is a good message to tell a king who got a divine revelation. Maybe less good is, how God gave everything into your dad's hands and really let him rule a lot, and how he kind of blew it in feeling proud and self-important, and you've inherited that same attitude and behavior, and God doesn't like that, and I've got to tell you, that means he's not happy with you, and you're in for a very bad time. That is a less flattering message to give to a king. The interesting thing is that he seems oddly receptive to that idea, but more importantly, Daniel also this is where we see some of the attitude of a prophet, right? Having been promised, oh, you can have power and stuff if you tell me what this means. He says, I don't need the power or the stuff. Don't worry about that. I'm just interested in, as is the place of a prophet, telling you what God wants you to know. And this is what God wants you to know. And again, not sugarcoating, right? There's a way there where you could tell the wrong message and try to win the king's favor, and there's none of that going on either. And it's, you've been proud, you've done wrong before God, and because of that, you are in for a very bad time. So Daniel interprets that message, and then he goes on to, then we see the writing on the wall. This hand was not lengthy, right? It was not writing a novel, which is part of why interpretation failed, right? If somebody just saw those 4 words written on the side of a subway or something, they wouldn't think anything of it. But because it was a disembodied floating hand, they decided the message must be important, which led them to want the interpretation. And that's where we see the words are not in Hebrew is important, and these are transliterations of what they are. The text talks a little bit about some of the roots and concepts behind them, but they pretty much have to do with the idea of limited short time and imposing doom, which is what happens. And then we see the king is receptive to this bad message and gives to Daniel the things that he promised, right? He gives him position, promotion, all of that, and then dies, like immediately, that very night. So points for Daniel, I guess, for correctly providing the interpretation there. As Joseph had before him, it ended somewhat differently, but there is that account. So we saw Daniel's 3 companions undergo this trial of holding true to the worship of God in the face of a reason not to, and to worship the king instead. Daniel was not present for that encounter for whatever reason, although we can presume that he, of course, was also not worshiping the king. So this is Daniel's version of that story. His companions are not present, and now it's Daniel. The idea is very similar. The attitude of the king is different, and the attitude of the king is different. The king likes Daniel. Daniel's doing a great job in a powerful role, way better than anybody else. The king has plans to continue to advance him, and basically he's one of the king's favorite guys. But the king, being a king who has no interest in serving God, also has this idea that worshiping the king is a neat thing to do, and a few ambitious, scheming people suggest that he codify that in a way that apparently is irrevocable within their law, if he manages to do so. And without thinking about the fact that Daniel probably isn't into worshiping the king and does worship his God, the king gets tricked into signing this thing that is apparently binding. And he can't just sign something else and undo it for whatever reason, but that gives us the drama and the story and the conflict. And so the king executes an ordinance, and anybody caught worshiping their gods is going to be in trouble, specifically in the form of being thrown in a lion's den. So you have the known conflict, in advance, the worship of God that leads to it, and then you have we'll get to the person serving God refusing to change course or veer in any way because the worship of God is more important than those things. So the king is caught in this spot where Daniel has to get thrown to the lions according to the law. As opposed to the furnace, where the king was really happy to be executing that particular judgment, and let's heat the furnace 7 times normal and make sure we really kill them. In this case, the king does not want to do this and does not want Daniel to die. And in fact, takes it so hard, he apparently refrains from kingly pleasures for the evening, and isn't able to sleep. And just, he does not want Daniel to die. Daniel spends what seems by all accounts a fairly casual evening or night in the lion's den. It's sealed, so nobody can let him out. He's just in there with the lions. And then in the morning, they go to check on the situation. The king calls out and very much hopes Daniel is fine. And Daniel responds basically to the effect of, yep, all good. So our first thought as readers might be, and the text helps us with this, might be maybe these are just some lame lions that aren't that hungry or don't really feel like eating. So Daniel comes out, no problem, and then the king takes the advisors who tricked him and throws them in, and the lions immediately have a field day. So we know that it's not that the lions weren't interested in eating. Again, we know that there was some outside force that was intervening on Daniel's behalf. God makes it okay for Daniel, and the king is on Daniel's side the whole time and is happy to bless and encourage and promote the worship of God after this miraculous encounter, and his relationship with Daniel grows and isn't everything great. Kind of a repetition of the earlier idea of you pick your important principle, you hold fast to it no matter what, and you accept any consequences, and God will ultimately protect you from death. It may not be from physical mortal death, but it will save you from ultimate and everlasting death, which is, again, where this is still relevant to us today, and it's where it was so relevant in the context of learning to coexist with the Greeks as well. You've got to hold true to your core principle, and everything else will go fine for you. And so that's this first section of the book of Daniel. We'll pick up in the next lesson. We'll look again at and further at some of the apocalyptic and more future-looking sides of the book. It'll take a pretty significant tonal shift, and we'll see some of how that goes in the next lesson. This has been an overview of Lesson 18 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. Thus says the Lord, God speaks through his servants, the prophets. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.